The night of March 3, 1969, settled heavily over the Central Highlands of Vietnam. In this region, maps offered little comfort. Elevation lines and grid references meant far less than the oppressive reality of jungle terrain where visibility collapsed to mere meters and sound carried in deceptive ways. For units of the North Vietnamese Army moving along the western approaches near the borders of Laos and Cambodia, darkness was not an obstacle but an ally. Doctrine emphasized night movement, concealment, and surprise, especially against American forces believed to rely heavily on air power and daylight reconnaissance. In this environment, North Vietnamese armored crews felt they were operating within a narrow but decisive advantage. Elements of the 202nd Armored Regiment had spent weeks accomplishing something few armies had attempted in Southeast Asia, moving tracked armor through dense jungle corridors and primitive road networks. Their PT-76 light tanks, Soviet-designed and amphibious, were chosen specifically for this task. Weighing roughly 14 tons and armed with a 76mm main gun, the PT-76 was intended for reconnaissance and infantry support, not prolonged tank-on-tank combat. But within North Vietnamese planning, it was sufficient. Intelligence assessments suggested that the remote American Special Forces camp at Ben Het was lightly defended, vulnerable to armor shock, and isolated from immediate reinforcement. As engines idled beneath layered canopy and crews waited for the signal to advance, confidence remained high. The tanks had arrived undetected. The approach routes had held. American airstrikes had not materialized. From the perspective of the North Vietnamese commanders, the engagement ahead appeared straightforward. Break the perimeter, suppress resistance, and withdraw before superior American firepower could respond. Nothing in their briefings indicated the presence of heavy U.S. armor. The assumption was logical. American doctrine rarely emphasized main battle tanks in terrain considered restrictive, especially jungle-covered highlands with limited bridge capacity and narrow roads. What the North Vietnamese crews could not see, and had not accounted for, was a deliberate shift in American defensive planning. In the weeks prior, U.S. Army commanders had quietly repositioned elements of the 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment, equipping Ben Het with M48A3 Patton tanks. These vehicles were not designed for stealth. At more than 50 tons, powered by a diesel engine, and armed with a 90mm gun, they represented overwhelming force when employed correctly. Their movement into the area had required significant engineering effort, road reinforcement, and logistical planning, all conducted under conditions intended to minimize detection. As the North Vietnamese tanks began to roll forward, the jungle ahead appeared unchanged. There were no visible firing positions, no obvious indicators of resistance. Yet the environment was no longer neutral. It had been prepared, measured, and observed. Unknown to the advancing crews, they were already within engagement zones calculated for weapons they did not believe were present. The ambush was not accidental. It was deliberate, doctrinal, and waiting for the moment when surprise would shift decisively in the opposite direction. The first indication that something was wrong did not come from enemy fire. It came from vibration. As the lead PT-76 tanks advanced through elephant grass and low brush, crews felt a deep, unfamiliar tremor traveling through the hulls and into the ground beneath them. This was not the sharp crack of recoilless rifles or the distant rumble of artillery. It was heavier, slower, rhythmic. To trained armored crews, it suggested mass in motion. Yet doctrine and intelligence both insisted such mass could not exist here. Moments later, the darkness ahead ceased to behave as expected. The jungle did not illuminate with muzzle flashes or tracer arcs. Instead, the night seemed to harden, as if the blackness itself had weight. Then the lead North Vietnamese tank was struck. There was no warning shot, no ranging fire. A single 90mm round from an American M48A3 Patton impacted with catastrophic force. The kinetic energy alone was sufficient to tear through the PT-76's thin frontal armor, detonating internal ammunition and fuel. In seconds, the tank was no longer a fighting vehicle but a burning obstruction, its wreckage lighting the trees in brief, violent pulses. Inside the following tanks, confusion spread faster than fear. Commanders shouted into headsets, demanding target identification. Gunners scanned through basic optical sights, seeing only fire and shadow. The absence of visible American positions defied expectation. North Vietnamese doctrine relied on night engagements to negate U.S. technological advantages, yet this engagement unfolded as if the Americans were operating with full daylight awareness. Each attempt to maneuver resulted in another precise impact. The intervals between shots were measured, deliberate, suggesting calm fire control rather than reactive defense. What the North Vietnamese crews did not realize was that the M48A3s were operating with integrated infrared observation systems paired with xenon searchlights filtered for infrared output. To the naked eye, these systems were nearly invisible, producing only a faint glow under certain atmospheric conditions. Through American infrared periscopes, however, the jungle was fully revealed. Moving vehicles appeared as clear silhouettes, their engines and tracks betraying their position with every adjustment. The PT-76 crews, lacking any comparable technology, were exposed without understanding why. As North Vietnamese tanks attempted to disperse and reposition, American gunners adjusted effortlessly. Hydraulic turret drives allowed rapid, precise tracking. Range estimation was no longer guesswork. Engagement distances remained well beyond what the PT-70SIX's 76mm gun could reliably penetrate, especially against the M48's cast steel turret, which exceeded 100 millimeters in thickness and benefited from curved geometry designed to deflect incoming rounds. The psychological balance of the fight collapsed quickly. The night, once considered protective, had become hostile. The jungle, once concealing, now offered no refuge. North Vietnamese crews were no longer executing an assault plan. They were reacting to a force they could not see, could not outmaneuver, and could not penetrate. The ambush had achieved its true objective. Not just physical destruction, but cognitive shock. As the engagement widened, North Vietnamese commanders attempted to impose order through maneuver. Surviving PT-76 crews were directed to flank westward, using bamboo thickets and uneven ground to break line of sight and regain initiative. The assumption was simple and deeply ingrained in armor doctrine. Movement creates uncertainty for the defender. In darkness, especially without visual confirmation, even superior firepower can be delayed or misdirected. For several moments, the maneuver appeared to succeed. Engines throttled back, tracks churned slowly through mud, and the tanks disappeared into what should have been total concealment. The response came almost immediately. American fire did not follow previous firing points. It arrived precisely where the moving tanks emerged. This indicated continuous tracking rather than guesswork. Infrared observation allowed American crews to follow heat signatures through vegetation, while stabilized optics ensured that target alignment remained accurate even as the tanks repositioned. When a PT-76 exposed itself briefly to return fire, its 76mm shell struck the frontal arc of an M48A3 turret and shattered into sparks. The hit was unmistakable yet ineffective. The curved cast steel absorbed and redirected the energy, leaving no penetration, no internal damage, and no reduction in combat capability. For North Vietnamese crews, this moment marked a decisive realization. They were not facing armored personnel carriers or reinforced bunkers. They were engaged against main battle tanks designed for high-intensity conflict in Europe, vehicles engineered to withstand direct hits from larger calibers than anything the PT-76 could deliver. Engagement ranges favored the Americans entirely. At distances beyond several hundred meters, the PT-70SIX's gun lacked both penetration and accuracy, while the American 90mm remained lethal and precise. Attempts to close distance were met with overwhelming firepower. As North Vietnamese tanks accelerated, American gunners shifted ammunition types. Canister rounds transformed the jungle itself into a weapon, stripping foliage, severing infantry support, and exposing vehicle silhouettes that might otherwise have remained obscured. The terrain that once enabled concealment now betrayed every movement. Infantry accompanying the tanks were forced to scatter, further isolating the armored elements. Compounding the tactical disadvantage was a growing logistical mystery. North Vietnamese radio traffic reflected disbelief, as crews reported the sound and weight of the enemy vehicles. The M48A3's diesel engine produced a deep, sustained roar distinct from lighter vehicles. The mass of its tracks altered the ground with each turn. Bridges along the approach routes had been assessed as incapable of supporting such weight. The presence of these tanks contradicted pre-battle intelligence entirely. As the fight continued, the North Vietnamese armored formation fragmented. Coordination dissolved under pressure from accurate, methodical American fire. Each destroyed tank reduced not only combat power but morale. The engagement no longer resembled an assault. It had become a series of isolated survivals, each crew attempting to escape an enemy that appeared to anticipate every move. The ambush had evolved into pursuit, and the technological imbalance ensured its outcome long before daylight approached. By the time the engagement reached its most intense phase, the North Vietnamese armored crews were no longer attempting coordinated action. Each surviving PT-76 operated independently, reacting to immediate threats rather than executing doctrine. This fragmentation was not accidental. It reflected the cumulative effect of fighting an opponent who controlled visibility, range, and tempo. The American tanks had shifted from defensive engagement to controlled aggression, advancing deliberately from prepared positions to compress the battlefield and deny escape routes. As the M48A3s rolled forward, they crossed terrain the North Vietnamese believed would halt any heavy vehicle. Minefields had been emplaced around the American perimeter, designed primarily for infantry and light vehicles. Explosions erupted beneath the advancing tanks, sending dirt and debris skyward. Yet the effect was marginal. The weight of the M48A3, combined with robust suspension and track design, allowed it to absorb blasts that would have disabled lighter armor. To the observing North Vietnamese crews, the sight was deeply unsettling. Obstacles that should have imposed limits simply failed to function as expected. One PT-76 crew attempted a final, calculated engagement. Closing to under 400 meters, they loaded a high-explosive anti-tank round, relying on shaped charge principles rather than kinetic penetration. The gunner waited for illumination from American machine gun fire, then released the shot. The round struck near the mantlet of an M48A3 turret, producing a flash and brief fireball. For a moment it appeared decisive, but the geometry of the turret worked as designed. The curved surface dispersed the shaped charge jet, preventing effective penetration. The American tank remained operational, its turret rotating smoothly toward the source of the shot. What followed was not immediate destruction, but exposure. The American crew switched their xenon searchlight from infrared to visible light. The jungle was suddenly flooded with intense white illumination, overwhelming dark-adapted eyes and eliminating concealment entirely. The North Vietnamese tank was revealed in full profile, immobilized not by damage but by certainty. Within seconds, American fire disabled its track mechanism. The crew abandoned the vehicle, retreating into terrain that now offered neither cover nor direction. By dawn, resistance had collapsed. Destroyed and abandoned PT-70 SIXS marked the approaches to the camp. American tanks idled openly, their presence no longer concealed or ambiguous. The engagement had demonstrated more than superior firepower. It revealed the integration of doctrine, engineering, and logistics that allowed American armor to operate where it was assumed impossible. For the North Vietnamese army, the battle introduced a new uncertainty. If heavy American tanks could appear here unseen and unchallenged, then no rear area or assumed limitation could be trusted. The jungle, once a domain of concealment and maneuver, had become a stage for a different kind of warfare, one defined by sensors, preparation, and industrial capacity. The ambush at Ben Het was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a collision with a technological reality that would influence North Vietnamese planning long after the wreckage cooled. As daylight fully revealed the battlefield, the engagement shifted from chaos to comprehension. With smoke thinning and visibility restored, North Vietnamese observers could finally see the machines that had dismantled their assault. The American tanks were M48A3 Pattons, vehicles conceived for large-scale armored warfare rather than jungle defense. Their presence explained every anomaly reported during the night. The precision fire, the ability to see without light, the apparent invulnerability to return fire, and the ease with which terrain obstacles had been overcome. The technical disparities were stark. The PT-76 had been designed for mobility and amphibious operations, prioritizing lightweight over protection. Its welded armor was thin by necessity, rarely exceeding 15 millimeters in critical areas. In contrast, the M48A3's cast homogeneous steel turret exceeded 100 millimeters in thickness along the frontal arc, with effective protection increased by curvature and slope. This was not a marginal advantage but an order of magnitude difference in survivability. The 90mm M41 gun carried by the Patton could defeat the PT-76 from well beyond visual range, while the reverse was rarely true even under ideal conditions. Equally decisive was the integration of night fighting technology. Infrared illumination paired with passive viewing optics allowed American crews to dominate darkness without revealing their exact positions. This capability aligned with broader U.S. Army doctrine emerging in the late 1960s, emphasizing sensor-assisted combat to offset numerical uncertainty and environmental constraints. What appeared supernatural to the opposing crews was, in reality, the practical application of systems developed for a very different theater and adapted effectively to Southeast Asia. Logistics completed the picture. Moving 50-ton vehicles into the Central Highlands required deliberate preparation, route clearance, bridge reinforcement, and sustained fuel supply. Combat engineers expanded narrow roads, placed temporary bridging solutions, and ensured that diesel-powered tanks could operate at extended range. These efforts unfolded quietly, deliberately, and outside the expectations of opposing intelligence assessments. The result was not improvisation but planning executed beyond the assumptions of the adversary. The implications extended beyond Ben Het. The engagement challenged the belief that jungle terrain inherently neutralized heavy armor. It demonstrated that when doctrine, engineering, and technology converged, traditional limitations could be redefined. For North Vietnamese planners, the lesson was uncomfortable. The environment they relied upon as a strategic equalizer could be inverted under the right conditions. By the end of the battle, the material losses were limited, but the conceptual impact was not. The ambush revealed that superiority was not only a matter of numbers or bravery, but of preparation and integration. Heavy armor, properly supported, could shape engagements even in terrain assumed to favor the defender. This realization would linger far longer than the physical wreckage left behind in the jungle. The Battle of Ben Het did not alter the strategic trajectory of the war, but it reshaped assumptions on both sides about what was possible. For the North Vietnamese army, the engagement underscored a hard truth. Terrain alone could no longer be relied upon to negate American advantages. The jungle, long viewed as an equalizer, had been penetrated not by chance, but by deliberate adaptation. Armor that was never expected to appear had arrived, fought effectively, and withdrawn intact. That reality demanded reconsideration of intelligence assessments, defensive planning, and the limits previously assigned to American ground power. For the United States Army, the engagement validated a doctrinal experiment. The deployment of M48A3 Pattons to Ben Het demonstrated that heavy armor, when paired with engineering support and night fighting technology, could operate decisively outside traditional expectations. The integration of infrared systems, ammunition versatility, and logistical foresight allowed a relatively small armored force to dominate a larger attacking element without suffering losses. This was not improvisation under fire. It was the execution of combined arms thinking in an environment where such thinking was often dismissed. The clash also highlighted the asymmetry between industrial systems. The PT-76 was a capable vehicle within its intended role, but it represented a compromise shaped by mobility requirements and manufacturing priorities. The M48A3 embodied a different philosophy: survivability, firepower, and endurance, even at the cost of weight and complexity. When these philosophies collided, the outcome was determined less by tactics on the night than by design decisions made years earlier in distant factories and test ranges. In the aftermath, the wreckage was left to rust, slowly reclaimed by vegetation. Yet the lessons endured. Ben Het became a quiet reference point in discussions about armored warfare in restrictive terrain, night combat dominance, and the decisive role of logistics. It illustrated that technological surprise does not always belong to the attacker, and that assumptions, once broken, cannot easily be restored. This was the night when the hunters became visible, and the environment itself changed sides. A brief engagement in the Central Highlands revealed a larger truth of the Cold War era. Conflicts were increasingly decided not only by courage or numbers, but by the unseen systems that shaped perception, movement, and fire. If you found this deep dive into Cold War armored warfare compelling, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more historically grounded stories where technology and doctrine collide in unexpected ways.